If you want to do well in the World Quizzing Championships, you need to work hard for sure, but you also need to work smart. In a quiz where absolutely anything could come up, how can you make sure that you spend your time working on the right things? There are over 60 subjects across the 8 WQC genres, and 10 of them collectively account on average for 42% of all questions. In this video, we're going to look at those 10 subjects. For the last 8 months, members of the All Things Quiz Patreon study group have been looking at each WQC genre, analysing what comes up in a bid to discover and understand how to do well at the WQC. We've looked at 5 years worth of questions, we've looked at the 60 plus topics named by the IQA, we've looked at subtopics, we've looked at geographic, chronological and demographic distributions. And if you want to watch the recordings of those study group sessions, then you can join our Patreon from £3 a month. A few health warnings. Warning 1. All conclusions in this video are based on our analysis and our interpretations of the topics, and our judgments on how the questions should be classified may not be the same as the people at the IQA who assemble the quiz. Warning 2. We don't actually know what will come up this year. And really, I'm not trying to predict particular questions, but this analysis provides some clear steers on what to focus on to maximise your chance of gaining extra points. And warning 3, this analysis is not aimed at the very top players. They probably don't need our help. But for anyone outside the top 50, there's probably enough here to help you move upwards year on year. These are the subjects as defined by the IQA. Now, I crunched the numbers, categorised the questions, and hypothesised what subject distribution is within each genre in an average year, and the result is this top 10. The eagle-eyed among you will notice that because of a tie in 10th place, there's actually 11. And number 10 is fauna. On average, there will be 3 questions each year on mammals, 1 about birds, and thereafter take your pick from fish, reptiles and amphibians for another couple of questions. The trick here is to look for the unusual. Australasian marsupials, monotremes, venomous mammals and lizards, all that sort of thing. This is what comes up here, the unusual, the remarkable. But don't overlook the obvious as well. It's just you're probably more likely to know it. Making up 23% of all entertainment questions is television. That's about 7 questions a year. Of those, about 75% ask for the name of a TV series, so be prepared to name a series based on a synopsis, plot points or cast members. 16% of the time you're asked for character names, and occasionally you need to name a performer, plot point or creator. One notable trend has been the influence of streaming TV. 28% of questions we looked at referenced Netflix, which makes sense in that its shows have a global reach as opposed to shows produced locally and then syndicated or picked up country by country. It has also led to a high profile for non-English language dramas. And while Netflix has dominated, other streaming services like Disney Plus and Apple TV and Hulu will surely emerge into the WQC canon. So our top tip here would be to look at the top performing shows globally on the main streaming platforms and pay close attention to hits that aren't in the English language and emerged in the last couple of years. That said, 55% of questions were about North American shows and 30% were about European shows. So ignore the traditional powerhouses of WQC television trivia at your peril. At 8 is famous people in history. The IQA lists both history and famous people as subjects, and in a lot of cases they are 2 sides of the same coin, and you could make an argument for things being an either. But I made the choice that if it was a history question where a person was the answer line or it was solely about their achievements, then it came into this category. And you're most likely to be asked about leaders, and perhaps because it was the most documented century to date, 20th century leaders are twice as likely to be asked about than ancient leaders who are in second place and 18th century leaders in third. Overall, the 20th century is the most common century for this subject, with military figures featuring heavily. Gender-wise, 78% of questions are about men and 66% are about white people. White men from Europe and North America dominate. Now, jointly at number 7, we've got some geography categories. We've got cities and human geography, and we've got physical geography. Starting with cities and human geography, on average, there are 3.5 questions a year on geographic subdivisions. That could be counties, states, prefectures. That's the sort of thing you're going for. 3.5 of those, so you need to know your geographic subdivisions. 2 of them are about naming capital cities or former capitals, including etymologies for their names. 1 to 2 are on areas, sites, notable things about cities, and 1 to 2 are about name the country from a description of a port or airport or landmark. Once every 3 years you might get a currency question or an industry question or something about the kind of population, but then they're not so common. Questions, however, are context filled. There are usually lots of different facts thrown in there to help you get to that answer. So the more you can learn about any city or population centre, the more you'll be able to join the dots and make educated guesses. Physical geography is harder to predict. There are usually at least 1 question on mountains, islands, rivers, lakes and climate. So that's 5. But with both of the geography categories, I think one of the things that they have in common is notability. So look for superlatives like the largest, the oldest, the most northerly, the most populous, the longest, etc. At 6 is film. In 2024, film dropped to its lowest number of questions in 5 years, but it's still comprised of 1/3 of the media genre. While there are questions that cover multiple decades, there is a distinct recency bias in evidence. Much like television, questions are most likely to ask you for a film's title. 44% of these questions are about films from the USA, and 57% of films are from after 2000. 28% were dramas, with comedy, sci-fi and animations coming in at around about 10% each. Actor, character and director questions are also well represented. Awards and questions on matters of production are less prevalent. Questions about actors are predominantly about male actors. That's about 2/3 of the questions about actors. And 1/3 of actors are from the US, and 50% have been active since the year 2000, even if it was just for a year. So again, a little bit of recency bias there. Talking about bias, 50% of the actors are white, with Asian and black ethnicities significantly behind. Where a person's name is required, they often cite multiple films in the question, especially if that person has died recently, and it's not necessarily say this actor who died in this year, but actually inspired by the obituary and information that came out about them. They might spot a nugget and they ask about that particular nugget in the question. So spotting who has died in the last year to 2 years is going to help you with this category. And of the awards that are given for movies, the Cannes Film Festival awards and nominations are more likely to be cited than any other award in these questions. And number 5 is pop music, which is distinct from things like world music, jazz, blues, classical music, opera. 75% of the questions are about pop acts. So you will be asked to name the act based on a description. 43% of the questions are name the band, given clues such as band members and songs or albums, and 32% are about solo performers. 11% of questions require you to name a song or an album, and slightly fewer ask you about lyrics. So you need to know the key performers. You need to know some of the things that they produced in terms of songs and albums, because they're going to be the clues. But it's about naming the band. Now, in terms of what eras of pop music come up, well, if there was an equal coverage of decades from the 60s to 2024, you'd expect to see just short of 15.5% of questions to each full decade. To that end, the 80s, 90s and 2010s have been overrepresented in the last 5 years. 60s and 70s are significantly underrepresented by comparison. Genre-wise, chart pop accounts for nearly 40% of the questions, with rock at 20% and heavy metal at 12%. 46% of questions relate to European acts, and 38% of questions relate to North American acts. Asian pop is just under 10% on average, but the K-pop explosion should see that rise. And number 4 is history, and this subject is distinct from the famous people from history as discussed earlier, and also questions that ask about ancient civilizations. So this is really the history of events and movements. And nearly 44% of the questions relate to European history, and 1/3 of those are about multiple countries, which commonly encompasses questions about wars, alliances, conquests and the like. 15% of questions about North America, likewise Asia, which encompasses the history of many of the world's great empires, but still only feature in about 15% of the questions. A third of all the questions are on 20th century history, with 19th century history coming in at around about 20%. In total, 65% of questions related in the last 5 years to events from the 18th century onwards, with the rest of history accounting for 35% of the questions. Patterns in the questions are hard to find until you hit the 19th and 20th centuries, and then we find that wars are a key focus, and the Second World War in particular. If we put the two history subjects together, then 38% of the questions are about wars and battles or people involved in them. And this is another subject area heavy on content about men and white people, and white men in particular. There are two subjects in equal second position. The first one of those is literature. On average, you can expect half of the media genre to be on literature. As perhaps might be expected, as the novel emerged as a literary form relatively recently, there is a significant recency bias to literature questions. There's not a huge amount of content being asked about before the 19th century, and then an explosion of 20th century content, and despite the century only being a quarter of the way through, there's been more 21st century content than 19th century content in the last 5 years. In fact, the single most heavily featured decade in the last 5 years has been the 2020s. So you really need to know your most recent modern literature and global literature sensations. But I talked about recency bias. Before the 19th century, the questions were asking about poetry and playwrights and were relatively thin on the ground. 19th century, there's a lot about French and Russian novelists dominating. And in the 20th century onwards, you're looking at novels and novelists and much more linguistic diversity in where those novelists are from and the languages in which they're writing. Questions are often inspired by recent author deaths, by which I mean the last 2 or 3 years, and it won't necessarily be about them having died, but their death might have inspired the writer of the questions, so obituaries are useful here as well. 51% of questions are name the author of questions. 29% ask for a title and 14% might ask for a character, quote, or location. And usually the questions triangulate clues from 2 of those groups to ask about the third. So you might be given the context which 19th century French author and some dates wrote works set in the reign of King Louis XV and featured the characters X, Y, and Z. Or in which work by Tolstoy does this character do that thing. So you're going to be given some context, and it's about you triangulating and piecing things together to get your answer. So this is a genre where context learning is very, very useful to help you rule answers in or out. 68% of questions that ask about an author ask about white male authors, and 53% of questions that ask for a title are about books by white men. A greater demographic diversity is present in questions about recent works. 52% of authors are from Europe and 28% are from the USA, and with recent authors you are more likely to be asked about female authors than further back in time. Also in second place is fine art, which represents half of the culture genre. 58% of questions in the last 7 years have been about European art, with North American and non-specific questions making up about 12% each. Renaissance art is the most commonly asked about, with Impressionism and Surrealism the next most commonly asked about. But there is a real diversity of styles and movements that comes up, and the following haven't been seen in the period 2018 to 2024, which could mean that some of them are due an appearance. Talking of being due an appearance, some of the leading female painters have not been asked about in the last 5 years. This includes Artemisia Gentileschi, Frida Kahlo and Georgia O'Keeffe. You'd have to think one of those will come up at some point. 80% of questions have been about white male artists or their works. Now, 2020 was a blip in that 4 questions were about female artists, but since then, on average, there has been about 1 question a year about a female artist. 87% of the questions have been about white artists, and 65% of questions ask you to name an artist based on works, their art movement, or biographical details. 28% ask about the title of a work, its subject, or a key feature, and the rest of the questions are about movements or organisations. And number 1, arguably this shouldn't be on the list, but exact sciences is described as physics, chemistry, etc. None of the exact sciences on their own would make the top 10, but collectively physics, chemistry, biology, geology, physiology, maths, and multidisciplinary science questions equate to 60% of the sciences genre. Of these, your priority should be physics and chemistry. Biology questions pop up in multiple genres, with human biology and diseases or conditions featuring in lifestyle, for example. And your likeliest biology questions are on medical discoveries. Whereas you can bank on at least 5 physics and 5 chemistry questions per set, and they will be over a spread of difficulty levels. With chemistry, there's usually 1 question on compounds, 1 on elements, and 1 on terminology or definitions, and 2 further questions could come from anywhere in the discipline. Whereas in physics, there will usually be 1 question on nuclear physics, 1 on particle physics, and 1 on astrophysics, with again 2 questions coming from elsewhere in the discipline. In both cases, it's worth knowing scientists, their discoveries, and Nobel Prize winners, as 1 question a year directly references Nobel winners. 2 questions a year relate to chemical elements or the periodic table, and 1 question a year relates to SI units. And there are 3 to 4 questions a year where Latin or Greek etymologies are used as clues. If you haven't nailed the level 2s and made good progress into level 3 international content in some of these subjects, then focusing on those should yield you some points. Before you look at any other subject, tackle these. Now look out for some more WQC preparation videos where we'll go into a bit more depth about techniques you can do to help shortcut your prep even in these subjects. And don't forget, for the more in-depth analysis of WQC genres, you can join our Patreon at patreon.com/allthingsquiz. If this video has been helpful to you, then please press like and subscribe. And most of all, best of luck in the WQC. Thanks so much to our Patreon members whose support has made this video possible and whose participation in the study group has contributed to the information that you've experienced in this video. If you want to become a patron, go to patreon.com/allthingsquiz. And for £3 a month, you can support this channel and get a range of benefits.